This is Ring of Fire with Sam Seder.
Sammy Cam is in effect, folks, at Sammy Cam Live, SammyCamLive.com. On the phone, Ian Gordon, writer for Mother Jones. He has also written for ESPN Magazine, Wired, and Slate. Ian, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So just give us a sense of what is happening at the border, or now, I guess, in these makeshift detention centers. Upwards around 50,000 unaccompanied immigrant children have crossed the border, I guess, since October. That's my understanding. Just tell us what is driving these kids. How are they getting here? Let us know what's happening.
Well, you're absolutely right about the numbers. It's over 50,000 kids in this fiscal year. And they're coming for a variety of reasons. I think, one of the things that we're not getting in kind of the mainstream media accounts of this is how complicated immigration really is. I mean, kids are coming, first of all, because the three countries they're coming from, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, are incredibly violent, all three of them. So there's that. But then there's also other reasons. I mean, there's poverty reasons. There's the fact that many of these kids have family in the United States. So there's a variety of push and pull factors that are playing into this. And in terms of how they're getting here, they're taking a very dangerous journey through Mexico, often riding on trains, having to deal with Los Zetas, which is one of the most kind of violent criminal organizations in the world, along the way. And, upon getting to the border, many of them are turning themselves into the Border Patrol.
So this isn't a question of there being there's some type of I guess a cat and mouse game at the border. They're basically saying, I've made it here to the border, and here I am, more or less. But I want to go back to first the push factors here.
Sure.
Has there been a marked increase in the violence in these countries? I was in Guatemala now. It's over 20 years ago. And I don't recall at the time being conscious of a lot of, particularly in Guatemala City, let's say, in a lot of violence. And I know that when we talk about the number one murder rate in the world, we're talking about several Honduran cities. Just give a sense of what has happened in those three countries over the past 5, 10, 20 years.
I think the Honduran case is particularly acute when we're talking about violence. This is a country that, just recently, just today, actually, the government reported that there have been 33 massacres since beginning of 2014 there. So it's a country that has really struggled since there was a coup several years ago to overthrow the former president Manuel Zelaya. There's been a lot of unrest, and the country really has struggled to deal with the gangs there. The kind of main gangs, Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18. In El Salvador, coming out of its years of war, they've had similar problems with the gangs, particularly in San Salvador, but elsewhere. And Guatemala has had a variety of problems since it ended its 36-year civil war in the mid-'90s. They've gone through huge stretches of abject poverty in the rural highlands, which is kind of home to many indigenous Mayans. And then Guatemala City has been a place where really impunity reigns. Guatemala, more than almost any country in the world, is a place where you can get away with almost anything. There's very little people don't get brought to justice there. So I think all of those things are contributing to this. And in terms of how they've gotten worse, I think that they have been bad for a while, and we're just seeing this come to a head now.
And we should make the point that we're not just seeing people leave these countries and kids leave these countries for the United States. They're also going to other countries as well.
Yeah, there's been a 700+% increase in kids going to places like Mexico and Nicaragua, filing asylum to other places in Central America, Panama. And that brings up a related point, which is, Nicaragua is one of the poorest places in the hemisphere, if not the poorest. It is not sending a lot of unaccompanied child migrants to the United States. And I think that tells you something about the violence and the effect that violence has, the violence from these three countries has on sending kids and pushing kids north.
And so the pull factors are relevant, but they're not determinant. And by pull factors, we mean to the extent that one exists, a perception that these children have that they'll be able to stay in this country, and the idea that they have family here. Give us a sense of both those factors. How many of these kids have family here, and what is the nature of the family that they have here? And is it the case that people are that these kids are coming up here because they hear things about the DREAM Act?
I think in terms of how many kids have family here, it's hard to get hard numbers on this. And also, like, what does family mean? Does that mean like your second cousin? Does that mean your aunt? Does that mean your parents? So I think it's hard to have like a set number that says, this percent of kids. But I think there is a large percentage of kids who have family who you would consider close family, maybe as far distant as, say, aunts and uncles. In terms of like what effect the DREAM Act has, that's something that came up as soon as this issue became politicized, particularly by House Republicans. Everyone started talking about, this is Obama's fault. This is, Obama using his power to put into effect DACA, for example, the Deferred Action Plan for young immigrants and the children of people who immigrated here. I think that's misguided because obviously kids who are here kids who are coming don't qualify for DACA, and also kids aren't as savvy as House Republicans would have you believe in terms of what laws have passed and what laws haven't passed. Now, I think that's something that. Are
you suggesting that kids in Guatemala and Honduras are not reading Politico on a daily basis and are aware of? I mean, of course, it's the notion is ridiculous. Unfortunately, some of the Republicans who are pushing this are getting laughed at about it. But all right, so let's talk about the practical implications of this. What is the law insofar as what immigration officials are supposed to do when they are faced with these many children or any children who are not from Mexico but from these Central American countries? Right.
So there's so when a kid is apprehended by the Border Patrol, the way it's supposed to work is he's supposed to be in Border Patrol custody for no more than 3 days, and at that point he's supposed to be handed over to Health and Human Services, who run about 100 shelters all around the country, but primarily in border states, primarily in South Texas, where the kids stay generally for about a month until they're reunified with family. At that point, during this entire time, the kid's still in deportation proceedings, and at some point, the kid will go to deportation proceedings and likely be deported, since there are very few means of relief for a kid to stay in the United States. So the majority of these kids have been getting deported. Now, one of the things you'll hear a lot is, oh, well, these kids don't go to their immigration hearings, and Border Patrol, a lot of Border Patrol agents have been quoted on background, so without their names, saying, "Oh, well, kids aren't going to their hearings." But that's something that we know isn't necessarily true. 90% of kids go to their first hearing, and then 30% eventually do not finish going to all their hearings. But a lot of those kids went to at least one or two or even three hearings. So what's happening is, with our lack of immigration judges, we have far too immigration judges for the amount of cases that we have. Kids just, their cases are lasting 2, 3, 4 years. And so what's happening is kids don't go through the process.
All right, Ian, we got to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about what happens when these kids get sent back and what happens while they're in that process that, like you say, could last years. We're talking to Ian Gordon from Mother Jones about immigration. We'll be back in just a moment.
Get online with Sam. Go to ringoffireradio.com. You're listening to Ring of Fire with Sam Seder, 800-783-7412.
The Sammy Cam is in effect. You can see that today I spent more time prepping than primping at SammyCamLive.com. Check out the Sammy Cam now. On the phone, Ian Gordon, writer for Mother Jones magazine. We are talking about the humanitarian crisis that exists at the border, and that's really what it is, isn't it, Ian? And we should say the reason that this process that these kids have to go through is a function of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act of 2008. Is that right? Do I have that right?
That's absolutely right, Sam.
So, okay, so these people these kids essentially go through this long process where, tell us the different potentials that can exist for, I don't know, out of 10 kids. What happens to each, one of those kids, statistically speaking? I mean, give us a sense of what's happening to these children.
Well, I mean, I think, if we're talking 10 kids, the vast majority of them are going to get deported ultimately. So seven or eight of them get deported, we'll say. And a few may qualify for legal status here in the United States. I mean, maybe one of them qualifies for asylum or for something called special immigrant juvenile status, which has to do with kids who've been abandoned, abused, or neglected. And then there's visas that are set aside for, victims of crimes or trafficking. But those, really, it's few and far between that kids qualify for those particular, forms of relief. So most of the kids are getting sent back. And I think that's something that's missing from this discussion. I think most people just assume, the kids disappear into the United States and we never see them again. And I think overwhelmingly that's not the case.
And so how long does that process take? It can take anywhere from, it seems to me, months to years. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, right now, the immigration courts are really backed up. And when I say really backed up, I mean people are waiting a year and a half for their first or second court date. I mean it's bad. And I was emailing the other day with the head of the immigration judges union, and she was giving me some raw numbers about how many judges there are and how many are set to retire this year. And I mean it's ugly. It's not a lot of judges. We're talking fewer than 300 judges, and many of them are getting up there in age. This is an issue that needs to be addressed, and it's something that needs to be addressed by something like comprehensive immigration reform, which is seeming less and less likely by the day.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think John Boehner has made it very clear that that's not going to happen, and the entire Republican Party says it's not going to happen as long as President Obama is president, and then, of course, it'll be whoever the next president is also problematic for them to pass something like this. Well, all right, so you have been down, I think it was in Guatemala, and wrote a story on what happens to these children. So for a lot of these kids, they're going to spend a year, 16 months, 2 years in the United States. They're either going to spend it, I guess, in a series of detention facilities or foster care places or with relatives. And then they're going to get sent back to hopefully, the country from which they're from. Tell us briefly what you know about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hopefully is right. I mean, there have been cases where kids have been sent back to the wrong country. So, hopefully they get sent back to their country of origin. When kids get sent back, it really, once they're out of U.S. custody, it's a bit of a free for all, and it's really dependent on the country they're sent back to. Guatemala is doing a much better job than they used to in terms of reintegrating kids and. I visited some of the shelters in Guatemala City and Quetzaltenango, which is the second biggest city in the country. And kids stay there for a couple of days while their parents can come usually from the highlands, many hours away to come and pick them up. But there are reports out there from other countries, from El Salvador and from Honduras, of kids being just released in major metropolitan areas. I mean, there's one report from 5 years ago. Basically claimed that the Honduran government was just releasing kids to their own devices in San Pedro Sula, which, as you mentioned earlier, is the most violent city in the world. So, wow. It really depends. And, obviously, this is part of the initiative, the $2 billion that the Obama administration wants to spend. Part of that is supposed to go to Central American governments to help them with their reintegration efforts. But, how are these governments going to use that money? What are they actually going to do? And how long is that actually going to take to implement these processes to have some sort of infrastructure awaiting these kids? I'm pretty skeptical of how much help it will actually be.
We just have a minute left. I mean, how possible would it be to absorb more of these children in this country? I mean, is it a function of relatives? Is it a function of there's not enough people stepping up to adopt these kids or to foster these kids? What needs to happen in that regard?
Well, I mean, I think that there is a capability to accept these kids. I don't know if there's political will to accept these kids. Building more shelters for these kids to stay in temporarily while family is found, finding more people to work for Health and Human Services to process these kids, to make sure that they're going to relatives and not traffickers. We can do this. It's not that complicated. It'll cost some money, sure. But it's something that we can do, and it's the right thing to do, and it's something that we should be doing, and currently we're not doing a good job of it.
Ian Gordon from Mother Jones Magazine, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Sam.
All right, folks, 800-783-7412. Why shouldn't we absorb these children? I know the reason why we don't. We'll be right back.